So, if you watched my Parasite Eve 1 video, you'd know that I'm a massive fan of that game. I absolutely loved pretty much everything that Squaresoft gave us in Parasite Eve. Things like the very unique combat system that felt like a blend of survival horror and JRPG, the awesome characters like Aya Brea and her partner Daniel, all of the great New York City environments to explore, and the overall amazing and uniquely Japanese sci-fi horror story made Parasite Eve a truly memorable experience when it originally released back in '98. I freaking love this game so much, and with all of that being said, it may come as a surprise when I tell you that I never actually played the game's sequel, Parasite Eve 2, back in the day. I just never got around to it, and I only ever heard mixed to bad things about PE2. A lot of my friends who played the game would tell me that Parasite Eve 2 was a Resident Evil ripoff, changing a lot of what made the first title unique in the gameplay department, featuring an entirely different battle system and being set in the Nevada desert. After watching a friend play through some of the game, I wrote off PE2 as an RE clone set in the desert, which had me very disappointed at the time. Fast forward to the year 2011, Square Enix re-releases both PE1 and 2 on the PSN store for digital download. Being very curious one night, I downloaded Parasite Eve 2 and began playing it fresh for the very first time. Once I completed my initial playthrough, I thought to myself, yeah, that game was pretty fun, but I also came to the same conclusion many had come to before me. Parasite Eve 2 felt a lot like a Resident Evil game in not only its gameplay but also in a few of its story elements. For years, I always found the gameplay changes in PE2 to be very interesting. Like, why did the developers do this? Why did they feel the need to change what I thought was a perfect game? It felt like for Parasite Eve 2 that Squaresoft wanted to move Aya and us as far away from Parasite Eve 1 as they could. Well, I've discovered a few interesting things about Parasite Eve 2's development in my research for this video. Parasite Eve 2 began its development pretty soon after the release of PE1. It probably won't come as a surprise when I say that the game we know as Parasite Eve 2 began its life as a Parasite Eve spin-off game starring a brand new character, private investigator Kyle Madigan, exploring an old, abandoned desert town. Squaresoft was still handling this side game's development, but the game's dev team was mostly comprised of new people. This meant that original Parasite Eve creator and producer Hironobu Sakaguchi wouldn't be involved with this title's development at all. The game's focus would also be more in line with other survival horror games of its time. This explains why the game that we ended up getting plays so differently and feels very not Parasite Eve in a lot of places. About halfway through the game's development, it was decided that this title would be promoted to sequel status. For what reason, I'm not entirely sure, but Aya Brea from the first game would be taking over the main character slot, while Kyle Madigan would be moved over into a side character position in the story. Like most of the games I talk about on this channel, Parasite Eve 2's development underwent some struggles, one of these difficulties being the lead character artist quitting halfway through the game's development. After this title became Parasite Eve 2, the game's original character artist dropped out of the project, leading Squaresoft to bring back Tetsuya Nomura from Parasite Eve 1. I'm glad this happened because Nomura's Parasite Eve art is excellent and makes this game feel a little bit more consistent with the first game, at least stylistically. With most of the character designs and in-game assets already established, it wasn't a difficult task for Nomura to work off of. After a full year of development time, Parasite Eve 2 released in Japan in 1999, and 1 year later for the rest of the world. I have a lot to say about this game. I find Parasite Eve 2 super interesting, so without wasting any more time, let's see where Aya Brea's journey after the New York City incident has taken her. The story of Parasite Eve 2 takes place 3 years after the events of the first game's mitochondria incident in Manhattan, New York. Rookie police officer Aya Brea has been promoted to agent status and is currently working out of the MIST branch of the FBI in California. She's pretty far from home. MIST being the Mitochondria Investigation and Suppression Team. Aya's new job at MIST has her hunting down rogue NMCs, neo-mitochondria creatures. These monsters have been cropping up all over the place recently. One night at the MIST shooting range, Aya receives a call to investigate a potential incident over at the Acropolis building in LA. After a quick chat and debrief with her colleague Pierce, Aya heads out. Arriving at the scene, Aya is greeted with what looks like a full-on crisis zone. As we approach the building, we're treated to this amazing pre-rendered FMV background that dynamically moves along with Aya. It's really impressive. Talking to a few officers, we learn that a SWAT team went into the building to investigate, but they haven't been heard from in a while. As Aya ascends the building and enters the tower's main main hall, we see what's left of the SWAT team. They're all dead. As Aya approaches a nearby phone, we see a shadowy figure run off. After Aya calls Mist HQ and tells them what's going on, we start our investigation proper. While exploring the tower, we find a few dying officers that give us items. One of these officers is alive and hiding. The officer hands us a key to the Acropolis cafeteria, so we head over there and search for answers. Stepping into the cafeteria, we see a woman sitting alone by herself. So yeah, Parasite Eve 2 features some new human mutations, and they are still horrifying and disgusting. The monster is very bullet spongy and takes a lot of punishment, but after we defeat it, we examine it carefully and find a metallic object that kind of looks like an activation device. Picking up the device, the monster comes back to life, but fellow FBI agent Rupert Broderick saves us. Aya fills Rupert in on what's happening here, then the two split up to cover more ground. After solving a bunch of Resident Evil-style puzzles, finding items and new weapons, and backtracking all over the place, we come across a church-like area where we find Rupert pinned down by a masked soldier. As the masked man locks eyes with Aya, he flees by jumping through the church's window. First monsters, now superhumans? Great. Rupert tells Aya to go after the mysterious man, while he calls for backup. Chasing after the masked soldier, we cross a bridge and access the roof of the tower. All along the roof, we find C4 strapped to the walls. After checking the roof's lift, we find that it's powered down, so we head back into the tower until the masked man jumps us. The man pulls out a detonator and threatens to blow up the building. Obviously, Aya can't let this happen, so she decides to fight back. Using parts of the environment and our retreating defensive tactics, we do enough damage to the soldier, prompting him to back off. He tells Aya that they'll finish this on the roof's helipad. Using the newly powered up lift and reaching the helipad, we confront the man, but he refuses to answer any of Aya's questions and instead threatens to detonate all of the bombs he's planted. The man then literally jumps to another skyscraper. Got some real anime moves here in Parasite Eve. He also triggers all of the bombs. Rupert eventually catches up to Aya, having already called in an FBI helicopter, and the two escape the exploding building. Sometime after this mission, Aya receives another assignment from her boss. Her new job is to investigate some potential NMC sightings in a small Nevada town called Dryfield, and this is where Parasite Eve 2 truly begins. The opening of Parasite Eve 2 is pretty strong. You've got a brand new mystery to solve, new types of monsters, and our main character has been moving up in the world. Sadly, the rest of PE2's story isn't that great. In Parasite Eve 2, you'll be spending a lot of time in the desolate town of Dryfield, and after that, a very dull laboratory sequence. You'll be meeting around 3 new significant characters on your journey, those being PI Kyle Madigan, one of the residents of Dryfield, Mr. Douglas, and a spoiler character that I'm not going to tell you about. Of course, all of Aya's new Mist colleagues are here, but you don't interact with them a whole lot. They're mostly off-screen or in phone calls. That's pretty much it for a lot of the game. The first 2 characters I mentioned are the most prominent, but also aren't that interesting either. Kyle is your standard mysterious stranger cool guy archetype who just sort of shows up and disappears when he feels like it. This gets explained later on in the game, but the explanation doesn't make his character any better or more exciting. It's just like, oh, that's what was happening. Okay. Mr. Douglas is your typical cranky old badass war veteran. He helps you around Dryfield and sells you weapons and ammo, but that's pretty much it. You never see him again after the Dryfield portion of the game. This title's cast of characters is nowhere near as diverse or interesting as the first games were. Every single character in PE1 were all likable, had a cool backstory, and got their time to shine with their own story moments and character arcs that would help Aya progress through the game. In PE2, everyone feels very bland. Well, except for Aya. You can tell that after surviving Eve in NYC and becoming an FBI agent, Aya has gained way more confidence than what she used to have in the first game. Aya can be very witty at times and is always badass in the face of danger, but every once in a while, that shy and unsure personality trait will come out, and that makes her feel more complete as a character, compared to all the others who feel very one-note. Can I talk about this guy, by the way? Mr. Anime Villain? So, one of the recurring baddies in this game is Golem number 9. Everything this guy does is straight out of a cartoon. He has an evil laugh during his boss fights, and he even wields a modified version of Squall's gunblade from FF8. I am not making that up. This guy feels so out of place in the Parasite Eve universe. He's super bizarre, and I just don't like him that much. Anyway, let's move on from that weirdo. Like a lot of survival horror games, Parasite Eve 2's story starts as something relatively small, but ends up becoming something a lot bigger that leads us to a grand Illuminati-esque conspiracy, like many of these games tend to have. The story definitely goes to some pretty cool places in the mid to late game sections, but overall it feels like not much happens. Don't get me wrong, Aya has some significant things happen to her, and there's even a new character that she meets that kind of turns her world upside down for a bit, but it's nothing like all of NYC getting destroyed by a freakazoid FF villain reject. Which is weird because the scope of this game's narrative is more significant than just NYC, which I guess should tell you how well written this game's story is. Overall, I can say that Parasite Eve 2's story is a very serviceable survival horror premise. It's not the worst thing out there, but it's not as good as its predecessor. It's definitely an exceptional framework for its gameplay. Which, by the way, let's take a look at PE2's radically different gameplay mechanics. So I think comparing the quality of the gameplay of PE2 to PE1 would be unfair and somewhat pointless because both of these games are completely different. If Parasite Eve 1 was 70% JRPG and 30% survival horror, then Parasite Eve 2 is like 90% survival horror and 10% JRPG. It's evident that with this title, Squaresoft was trying their hand at a Resident Evil style game. With that particular goal in mind, Parasite Eve 2 copies basically every game mechanic from the original Resident Evil games, one of those mechanics being tank controls. Now, if you've watched any of my Resident Evil videos, you already know that I love tank controls. I think they work correctly for fixed camera angles, and I would never want to play a classic RE without them. Now, going from PE1 to 2, the first game using traditional 3D movement control like an FF game, and then switching to tank in the sequel, is pretty weird and disappointing. The camera in the first game was pulled back almost always at a top-down perspective, so you can see everything and move around in a traditional 3D way. With PE2 emulating RE, all of the camera angles are close up to support that tank-controlled movement and hiding things just off screen. We'll talk more about this in just a second. Like I said, I love tank controls, but every time I play PE2, I always try to move around like it's the first game. I see Aya and I'm like, oh yeah, traditional 3D movement. And then I have a panic attack because she begins moving in a tank-controlled way. I think it's a personal gripe that I have with this game. In any event, the controls are tight and work well. It's not bad by any means, it just takes some getting used to, especially if you're coming off the first game. Unlike the first game's partial real-time turn-based battle system, PE2 uses a completely real-time battle system for its enemy encounters. Guess what, guys? It plays very similarly to RE. This time, aiming is a complete lock-on button toggle instead of a light lock-on button hold, which is good and bad because you'll never lose sight of an enemy, but Aya also has to completely turn around to aim at a monster when you move away from it. This can sometimes take a while because Aya turns really slowly, leaving your back open for cheap shots from enemies. This probably could have been remedied with a 180 quick turn option like in RE3. Even with that one minor complaint, I can confidently say that the battles in PE2 are really fun. As you play, you'll be finding and purchasing a plethora of different weapons, ranging from things like different kinds of pistols, an assault rifle, a grenade launcher, and a shotgun, which all play and feel very distinct from one another. You'll also be finding specific upgrades for certain weapons, which means PE1's very deep weapon customization is nowhere to be found in this game, which is a letdown for sure, but since so much of this game is different, it's not that bad of a change. Parasite energy makes its return from the first game, and it's really neat in this title. So in PE1, Aya's powers were gained as you leveled up. These powers were very similar to white and green magic spells that you'd find in any classic FF game. Basically, buffs, debuffs, and healing abilities. In PE2, you no longer level up by gaining experience points. Instead, you earn a certain amount of EXP after battles that you can use to unlock and upgrade your parasite abilities. The abilities in this game range from fire-based attacks, debuffs like poisoning your enemies, buffing your defense, healing yourself, and gaining devastating super attacks like Energy Shot. And get this, combustion. That's right, you can use the ability that Eve used in the first game to ignite all of those poor innocent people. I like this because from a lore perspective, Aya has the same powers that Eve did, but Aya isn't evil. She uses her abilities for good, and I find that to be very cool. Eve and Aya really were one and the same after all. The amount of parasite abilities you'll be unlocking and upgrading is pretty impressive and offers a good amount of customization for different playstyles. By the way, all of the abilities are unlockable from the start of the game, so once you have enough EXP, you can unlock these skills in any order you want. Using weapon attacks and Aya's superhuman abilities together makes battles really fun to play. You can set up specific chain attacks like knocking enemies down with an AoE force push and then finishing them off with your firearms while they're incapacitated, or use combustion to utterly annihilate the full group of monsters while they're stuck on the ground. It's really great and adds a lot of variety to the combat. Speaking of variety, the enemies you'll be facing off against in PE2 are all pretty unique. Like I mentioned earlier, this game features a bunch of brand new human mutations, but it also has animal mutations like in the first game. Some of those monsters from Game 1 show up here too. I have to say, the Mitochondria Camel Man monster is still an absolute nightmare. It's terrible. Look at that face. Every enemy has its own moveset, and fighting against them all is pretty fun, but of course, some cheap tricks can happen here and there. My biggest complaint with battling in PE2 is the camera. As I was saying earlier, the camera in the first game was pulled back a lot like an FF game, giving the player a clear view of everything going on at all times. PE2's camera is like Resident Evil's with close-up angles, hiding monsters off screen. This is fine in RE games where you're fighting slower enemies most of the time and can't aim and move. Almost 90% of all enemies in PE2 move very fast and have very long-ranged attacks that can hit you from off-screen. Those camel guys I talked about have a crazy charge attack where they rush at you no matter where they are, even if they're off-screen. It's almost impossible to know where to move if one of these creatures begins its charge off-screen. This move definitely sucks, but it's not all bad. Once you get the hang of the controls and learn the environments you'll be battling in, you can actually trick up these charge attacks by moving out of the way at the last second, making the enemy collide into a wall that damages them and makes them fall down. I recommend for every enemy encounter to find a camera angle that can fit all of the enemies in frame so that you can reduce the chances of cheap shots like this happening. Besides all of the standard enemies, there's also a handful of bosses at critical moments throughout the game. Most of the boss fights are massive creatures like the terribly designed Burner. Seriously, this massive hell monster is just strolling down the street like it's nothing. I don't like this thing's design. It looks like a Doom monster, not a Parasite Eve monster. Anyway, how do the bosses play, you may be asking? Well, they're good. Nothing too impressive, but also nothing terrible either. I really like the monster you fight in the lab's garbage disposal area. You have to use your head when it comes to which abilities to use and when to attack when it opens its mouth to try and suck you in. This is probably the best boss in the game. It feels like a classic survival horror boss, being 50% battle and 50% puzzle. About halfway through the game, you'll encounter an albino version of the camel monsters. I thought this boss was pretty weak. It just runs around in circles, and if you stand still for too long, it'll magically jump right on top of you, no matter where you are or where it is. It looks horrifying, but it's not very fun to fight against. One piece of advice if you decide to play this game, for boss fights, make sure you invest in the poison ability and the energy shot ability. The poison skill helps with draining a boss's HP over time as you deal normal damage with your weapons, and energy shot massively buffs your regular attacks, so if you use these two abilities together, you'll make short work of most bosses. Overall, the bosses are pretty good. Some are better than others, but they all do a pretty good job at offering a nice challenge at the end of each area. Which reminds me, every area after the skyscraper level is, I hate to say it, pretty boring and unfortunately quite tedious. So after the Acropolis Tower, Aya heads over to the small town of Dryfield. To those of you who don't currently live in Nevada, this level might be cool to see, but for me, someone who lives in the desert, it's not that interesting. The thing that brings this level down is its insane amount of backtracking. Dryfield features a bunch of fetch quest type objectives that you'll have to complete. Things like finding a gasoline can for Mr. Douglas's truck. Oh, I just ran all the way through 4 loading zones, only to find out that I have to go to the gas pump and fill the can up manually. After 5 minutes of backtracking through loading screens and doing random battles, now Mr. Douglas can fill up his truck. Oh, okay. Why not have the can already be filled up when I find it? It's a freaking video game. Oh, what's that? I heard a woman screaming in this one house next door. The front door is blocked from the inside, but I managed to find a secret door leading into the house. The door is fastened to a wall with some sturdy looking bolts. Looks like I'll have to backtrack to the garage and get some tools to remove these bolts. Oh wait, I can't pick up the tools yet, because I have to ask Mr. Douglas if it's okay to take them. I'm an FBI agent hunting nightmare monsters, and I have to ask this old man if it's okay to use one of his wrenches to potentially save someone's life. The best part about this is that 10 minutes later, you go back with the tools and the woman is still screaming her head off. This whole situation is like a comedy routine. The amount of backtracking here is baffling. After Dryfield, Aya and Kyle travel to an old shelter in the middle of the desert where they discover a secret underground lab. The lab in this game is very maze-like and gray. It's tough to tell where you even are most of the time. And this is the part of the game where the map comes in handy, because almost every room and hallway looks the same. The lab doesn't have a ton of backtracking, but it does suffer from having some really generic level design. After searching the lab for a little while, you find a completely new area called Neo Arc, which is a tropical rainforest underground or in the desert. I'm not sure where this place is located, but it comes out of nowhere. The Ark has a bunch of stronger enemy encounters and a lot of really lame puzzles, like move this crap around until a door unlocks, step on these pressure plates until something really far away unlocks, kill these 2 big monsters, then go back to the lab. It's deflating having to do such basic and obviously thrown together stuff to progress in your game. On my recent playthrough, I wasn't super into anything that was happening in the Ark, and that sucks because the concept of this vast, hidden away habitat is both exciting and interesting, but it doesn't really go anywhere. That's all I'm going to be talking about with the structure of this game, because I want you guys to play and experience the game for yourself. I don't want to go into massive spoilers too much. The last thing I'll be talking about before we end this video is the worst thing about Parasite Eve 2, and that, my friends, is its soundtrack. As you probably already know, the first game's OST is fantastic and commonly well regarded by many old school video game fans. It was made by legendary Square composer Yoko Shimomura. Since this game started as a spin-off, obviously there wasn't much reason for Shimomura to come back and make more music. Naoshi Mizuta instead composed PE2's soundtrack after the game was completed. Overall, the tracks featured in PE2 are good but very different. Shimomura herself described PE1's OST as an inorganic New York horror soundscape, and that represents that game's music perfectly. In Parasite Eve 2, the music ranges from very standard sounding horror tracks to some really atmospheric pieces that reminded me of songs I'd hear in a game like Silent Hill. The problem is, you never really hear the music while you're playing the game. Most of your time trekking around Dryfield or in the labs will be pretty silent until a battle starts, which honestly, the battle theme in this game is so quiet, it's also nowhere near as catchy or memorable as PE1's battle theme. Actually, you can say that about every piece of music in this game, which is a real shame. Back in the day with big games like Parasite Eve and Final Fantasy, these titles didn't have voice acting a lot of the time. The devs would have to rely on the music to drive emotion into everything that you would see on screen. This meant if you arrived at a new location, the music in this new area would have to perfectly represent what you were about to see and experience in the story. If you were squaring off with a rival or a difficult boss or enemy, the music that accompanied that battle better be off the freaking hook and get you fired up to win. In PE2, you never really hear the music, and none of it is that memorable. Even tracks that are from the first game are remixed to be so laid back and quiet. Like, I think I can hear the police station theme song from PE1 in Mist HQ, but I could also be mistaken. Speaking of memorable tracks, I can think of so many moments from Parasite Eve 1 where the music knocked my socks off. I remember vividly, right in the beginning of the game, when you go backstage and read Melissa's diary, it reads like a crazy person's ramblings, but then all of a sudden the game starts playing a creepy version of the opera theme from earlier. It dawns on you that you're reading Eve's diary, and clearly things are really messed up with this person, heightening the mystery that needs to be solved. Like, it perfectly sets up the villain of the story, the woman you'll be facing off against for the next 8 hours of the game. It's such a tiny moment, but it's stayed with me ever since I played the game for the first time like 20 years ago. By the way, PE1 has so many other amazing moments just like that one I could think of off the top of my head. Guys, everything that happens with Daniel, him facing himself, learning how to be a better father for his son and Aya. How about when you talk to Dr. Clamp and as soon as he brings up the mitochondria, that specific piece of ominous music starts playing. You know he's up to something. It's so awesome. The reason all of these moments stick out in my mind is because of the stellar music. When I think about Parasite Eve 2, things like the sliding picture puzzle pop into my mind, or the weird anime stuff with Golem number 9 and his gun blade. The music never pops into my mind as a positive memory, and that's not something I'm happy to say about a game called Parasite Eve 2. Parasite Eve 2 is a disappointing sequel, not because it's a bad video game. I have a lot of fun with battling monsters and customizing Aya's abilities and loadout. Also, seeing Aya grow more as a character and moving on with her life after NYC is cool. This title is disappointing because it's not Parasite Eve. It's trying to be something else, and after my recent playthrough, it's obvious that this game was supposed to be something else. As soon as I learned that this game was supposed to be a side adventure, I was immediately conflicted. Like, I've heard for years that this game was bad and trying to copy the success of Resident Evil. I can't say that about PE2 if it was supposed to be a side game that focused more on survival horror. I think it's unfair to Parasite Eve. It honestly makes me sad because clearly the devs didn't have much confidence in the spin-off idea, forcing Aya and her story into this framework, unfortunately making fans of the first game who were expecting a true sequel disappointed. So my final verdict on Parasite Eve 2. Fun gameplay, weirdly bad story, forgettable characters, not as good soundtrack. I think you guys should still play this game though, especially if you're a fan of survival horror. I want you guys to experience PE2 for yourself. You may like it. It's got competent gameplay mechanics and some decent replay value and unlockables. Just don't go in expecting Parasite Eve 2, if you know what I mean. If you want to play this game, you can get a physical copy on websites like Amazon or eBay, but know you might be spending a nice chunk of change on it. If you want a cheaper alternative, the game is available on the PS3 store for around $6, a very reasonable price for this game, I feel. With that version, you can also take it on the go with PSP and PS Vita. If you're still curious and looking for an interesting take on survival horror with some very light JRPG elements, then feel free to check out Parasite Eve 2, just as I did all of those years ago. Or you can always play the first game if you haven't already. Yeah, maybe do that instead. Ah well, maybe next time Square will deliver on a true Parasite Eve 3.
It was the winter of 2010, when the Twisted were identified as unknown life forms that erode time and space. The government created a special organization to destroy these creatures. The CTI, the Counter-Twisted Investigation Team, by way of the Overdive system, which allows the changing of the past in order to better the present. The only candidate who was deemed compatible with the system was one who had lost all of her memories. Her name, Aya Brea.
Oh no. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Parasite Eve 2 is weird, and I should probably make my next video about a game that I really like. I really wanted to get this video out earlier, but of course many IRL things happened to come up recently, and I had to focus all of my attention on that stuff, unfortunately delaying some of the work I had left on this video. In any event, if you liked this video, please consider subscribing and checking out my Patreon. You can support this channel for as little as $1 per month. You can also gain access to my exclusive Patreon show called Inside the Sphere, where I talk about video game news and what I've been up to. Any support really helps me out, and I want to give a shout out to all of the people who are currently supporting and sticking with me, even when difficult things and delays happen to come up in my life. I love all of you guys, seriously. Anyway, I'll see y'all in my next video. It should be one hell of a party. Later.